Good evening and welcome to NTD News. I'm Stephanie Cox. Here are today's top stories. A 17-year-old was arrested after deadly shootings in Kenosha last night. The teen said he was trying to protect the businesses that were set on fire the night before. Speakers at the RNC last night warning against letting America's freedom be eroded by socialism. They also stood up against cancel culture and mob rule. The Department of Health and Human Services gives the latest on the nation's virus recovery. One health official says federal guidelines are delivering good results. Hurricane Laura has been upgraded to Category 4. According to data from airplanes, it might be getting stronger still. The Department of Justice is probing 4 state governors for potentially irresponsible and lethal virus guidelines they gave nursing homes. And a paper shredding truck spotted outside the Chinese consulate in San Francisco is raising suspicion. And that's after the same kind of truck appeared in front of the Chinese consulate in New York just 3 weeks ago. Now some updates after last night's violence in Kenosha, Wisconsin. 2 people were killed and 1 was injured. A 17-year-old boy is now facing a first-degree murder charge. If convicted, the teenager would be charged as an adult under Wisconsin's law.
Kyle Rittenhouse, a juvenile, was arrested in Illinois and is now in jail, awaiting his court date this Friday. He fled Wisconsin to Illinois after the shooting. Rittenhouse was interviewed by a journalist for the Daily Caller before the incident. He said he came to Kenosha to protect the business that was set on fire the night before and others like it. He also indicated that his firearm was for protection and that he aimed to help people who may have gotten injured. No police were involved in last night's shooting. It was the 3rd night in a row that protests turned violent since Jacob Blake Jr. was shot 4 times in the back by a police officer. The shooting happened after Blake walked away from 2 police, ignoring commands, and reached into his vehicle. An investigation is underway into the incident. Blake's family attorney says that his medical diagnosis right now is that he is paralyzed. Blake's mother said her son would disapprove of damage done to the city, declaring, "It doesn't reflect my son or my family." During the chaos last night, 300 to 400 demonstrators defied the city's 7 p.m. curfew and went to Kenosha County Courthouse. Some hurled water bottles, bricks, firecrackers, and other objects at police. Deputies fired tear gas canisters into the crowd. The city sheriff says that some of the demonstrators are coming from outside Kenosha and have no desire to protest. The city made a request to the state for assistance. Governor Evers has allowed the National Guard to go in and help quell the violence. Trump praised the governor's decision to allow the National Guard into the city and called on Portland to do the same, as Portland has now seen nearly 100 nights of violence. Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
Kenosha's sheriff says they do not plan to let the violence continue. He says they will support protesters before the 7 p.m. curfew, but that after that, they will take people into custody for violating the curfew. Troops are now in Kenosha, prepared should another night of violence break out. And headline speakers on night 2 of the RNC took a stand against the radical left. They denounced anarchy, mob rule, and cancel culture. The speakers warned against socialism eroding our freedoms and against the dangers of allowing our country's history to be destroyed. NTD's Kevin Hogan brings us more.
And to believe that if you play by the rules.
On the second night of the Republican National Convention, Kentucky's Attorney General Daniel Cameron voiced his concerns about the violence and anarchy that is terrorizing American cities. He said the Republican Party recognizes those who earnestly strive for peace, justice, and equality, despite mobs burning businesses and attacking police and innocent bystanders. Cameron criticized Biden's comment that if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. Cameron said the use of leftist identity politics is unacceptable.
And he is captive to the radical left, a movement committed to cancel culture and the destruction of public discourse. They believe your skin color must dictate your politics. And if you fail to conform while exercising your God-given right to speak and think freely, they will cut you down.
Florida's Lieutenant Governor Jeanette Núñez is the daughter of 2 Cuban immigrants. She said chaos spread quickly when Fidel Castro took over Cuba in 1959 when the government confiscated private property. Her parents fled the country when the Castro regime abolished freedom of religion. She says Americans are faced with choosing between a path of chaos and government control or one of freedom and opportunity.
Fellow Americans, the fabric of our nation is in peril. Daily, the radical left systematically chisels away at the freedoms we cherish. They peddle dangerous ideologies, cower to global progressives, and normalize socialism to dismantle our Constitution.
Abby Johnson is a former Planned Parenthood employee who is now a pro-life activist. After she witnessed the horrors of an ultrasound-guided abortion firsthand, she began to fight for unborn Americans.
Nothing prepared me for what I saw on the screen. An unborn baby fighting back, desperate to move away from the suction. And I'll never forget what the doctor said next. "Beam me up, Scotty." The last thing I saw was a spine twirling around in the mother's womb before succumbing to the force of the suction.
The RNC featured another speaker who experienced what he describes as an assault from the fake news media and the far left after he attended the March for Life at the Lincoln Memorial in January 2019. He recalled that during the event, professional agitators tried to provoke a response from him to smear Trump because he was wearing a MAGA hat. The media defamed him without asking for his side of the story. He later realized he had been canceled by the left.
Canceled is what's happening to people around this country who refuse to be silenced by the far left. Many are being fired, humiliated, or even threatened. And often, the media is a willing participant.
Sandman says his only thoughts as he stood there were not to do anything to agitate the man with the drum, nor to do anything that would embarrass his family, school, or community. He won a settlement against the media who defamed him and said President Trump offered him his support throughout the media nightmare. Notable speakers on night 3 of the RNC include Vice President Mike Pence, Laura Trump, and esteemed human rights activist Chen Guangcheng. Chen was persecuted in China for standing up to the CCP's one-child policy using forced abortions and forced sterilizations in Shandong province. Kevin Hogan, NTD News.
As our nation seems to split ever more along ideological lines, one university professor shares his experience about how these societal challenges are playing out on college campuses. NTD's Melina Weisskopf has more on that.
As an adjunct professor at NYU, and after having spent nearly a decade on Ivy League campuses, Professor Mark Brennan says one of the biggest problems he sees on college campus is the erosion of civil discourse. In a videocast with the Charlemagne Institute CEO, Professor Brennan explains how much pressure he faces on campus when it comes to discussing sensitive and highly politicized topics with his students.
But I won't touch that topic with a 10-foot pole in an academic environment. And the kid's face just dropped. And he said, "Why not?" I said, "Because someone will overhear us. They'll hear I said the word gun, and it's going to start a panic. And Professor Brennan, whichever side of the debate my comments come out on, it's going to upset somebody, and it's going to explode, and I'll be out of a job."
He says this pressure of ideological conformity even extends to his students, since many professors are what he calls new school liberals and who reject differing viewpoints.
Because you will submit a paper that's well argued and reasoned and supported by the evidence, and you'll hand it to some ideologue, and that ideologue will attack you unmercifully.
Another recurring issue he sees is that college campus has become a place where students are coddled instead of taught how to handle real-life issues.
I'm really nervous about this group that we're coddling and forcing to pursue these summer internships that don't do anything to build character or create resilience.
He suggests that a step toward changing these problems is to prioritize teaching life skills, and as a society, to value character development over prestigious college labels. Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
The Department of Justice is requesting data from the governors of 4 states over concerns that their orders may have resulted in thousands of deaths in nursing homes.
The DOJ is requesting the governors of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Michigan to provide data on their pandemic responses in nursing homes. Orders from these 4 states require nursing homes admit CCP virus patients into their facilities, exposing their already vulnerable population to the illness. Nursing homes were also prohibited from requiring patients be tested before being admitted. According to the CDC, over 30,000 people died from the virus in New York. Over 20,000 of those deaths are from nursing homes. The Pennsylvania Department of Health lists over 5,000 CCP virus deaths. The New York Times shows over 4,000 of those deaths were from long-term care facilities. Results of the data will determine whether the DOJ can launch an investigation under the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act. The act protects the rights of people in nursing homes and other facilities. The DOJ is trying to determine if these state orders were responsible for the deaths of many nursing home residents.
The Department of Health and Human Services responding to recent concern about changes to the CDC's virus testing guidelines. The agency says it's about making the testing more targeted.
The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services expressed high hopes for the nation's recovery from the pandemic. Assistant Secretary for Health Admiral Brett Giroir says the national strategy to combat COVID-19 is working. New daily cases have dropped by 22% from 2 weeks prior. Of 56 U.S. jurisdictions, 2 are on a flat line, while 80% have a downward trend. Despite promising numbers, some experts are worried about a recent change to the CDC's testing guidelines. The revised guidelines say people who've been in close contact with an infected person do not necessarily need a test if they do not have symptoms. Some health experts say this can make the reports on the virus's spread inaccurate. Giroir says, however, that the government is aiming to do more appropriate testing of asymptomatic people, not less, saying that where there's a high rate of infection, they'll do more testing of asymptomatic people. He also said the gains the country has made will be reversed if it abandons the national strategy to contain the pandemic. Next month, the U.S. will have done more than 90 million virus tests.
The CDC has put out a new guideline for retailers on what to do if customers refuse to wear masks. The CDC is recommending to retail and service employees, firstly, not to argue. The guidance says workers should not try to force customers to follow their company's virus prevention procedures. They warned that people could turn violent or make threats in such circumstances. The CDC suggests conflict resolution training, security cameras, and setting up areas in the store where staff can go to feel safe. There have been several high-profile conflicts between employees and customers who refuse since the pandemic began. And up next, Hurricane Laura has been upgraded to Category 4. According to data from airplanes, it might be getting stronger still. And not only coastal areas are fearing landfall, the hurricane's impact might even be felt further inland. And in California, people are still in fear of another threat. The wildfires have been putting pressure on residents and officials for days. Firefighters from several states are digging out containment lines to stop the spread of the fires. The National Hurricane Center issued a warning that Hurricane Laura has entered Category 4 and is extremely dangerous. Over 20 million people are in Laura's path. More than 400,000 Texas residents and another 200,000 in Louisiana are under mandatory evacuation orders.
Hurricane Laura is on a steady track to hit Texas-Louisiana Gulf Coast after dark. Its impact might be disastrous.
So things changing rapidly here, but what's not changing is the fact that this is going to be a catastrophic, life-threatening event. Let's go through.
State and federal emergency management teams rushed to provide shelter accommodations and get first responders in place for possible rescues. The storm had been expected to become a Category 4 hurricane.
So as we were talking about the last few days, expecting that intensification, and it happened overnight. I mean, just look at, you can see the eye right here. You can see where the aircraft, the wind barbs, when they come back here, you'll see the blue wind barbs. That's the flight of the plane going right through the center, in and out of the center.
He added that the airplanes flying through the hurricane center are getting the latest details about the winds, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration satellites are also working on it. Data suggests that the hurricane might keep getting stronger.
The warm air feeding the storm, coming out the top and then fanning out, signifying that it's breathing. It's a very healthy storm, and what that tells us is there's still actually room for further intensification.
The storm is also expected to spawn tornadoes Wednesday night in Louisiana, southeastern Texas, and southwestern Mississippi. There will likely be widespread flooding in urban areas in eastern Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas on Wednesday and Thursday.
The worst damage will clearly be done to the coastal areas, but those are not the only places where landfall is expected. Even areas many miles inland are expected to be hit by Laura.
Hurricane Laura is expected to cause catastrophic damage and unsurvivable storm surge to the Gulf Coast near the Texas and Louisiana border. An inn in Galveston had windows boarded up and a sign that said "First virus, now this." Laura was located 200 miles southeast of Port Arthur, Texas on Wednesday afternoon. It's expected to pack winds of up to 145 miles per hour before landfall on Wednesday night. The catastrophic storm surge could penetrate up to 30 miles inland from the coastline between Searim State Park, Texas, and Intracoastal City, Louisiana. Water levels could rise as high as 20 feet in parts of Louisiana. One man at the beach says he's not worried about his house.
I'm not really worried about my house. I live on the high part of the island. But it's still a really strong storm, so I want to get out of the way.
Crude oil production in the Gulf of Mexico has been halted. Companies have battened down operations. Output cuts are nearly 90%. That's a level not seen since Hurricane Katrina in 2005.
The second and third largest wildfires in California's history are currently blazing through the state. Firefighters from neighboring states are now digging out containment lines to stop the spread.
California is battling some of the worst fires in the history of the state. More than 20 major blazes were sparked by dry lightning during a record heat wave. In Santa Cruz County, 4 people are still missing after the CZU Lightning Complex fire destroyed over 300 homes and other structures. Higher humidity and gentler winds helped firefighters get a grip on the fires, but temperatures and wind speeds are expected to pick up in coming days. Over 14,000 firefighters from half a dozen states are helping Californian firefighters carve out containment lines around the fires. They're using bulldozers and hand tools to scrap fire breaks into the earth. Those breaks are meant to hinder the flames from spreading further. At one point, almost 250,000 people were under evacuation orders. That number has gone down, but it still stands at over 130,000. Some homeowners are slowly being allowed back in to survey the damage and see if their homes are still standing. One resident said he found only ashes and melted metal at a site where his home used to be. He had built it with his own hands and lived there for 32 years.
There's about 3,500 square feet of house. It's gone. There's 1,200 square feet of garage with a 1,200 square foot 3-bedroom, 2-bath apartment on top of it that's gone. And a 2-stall barn gone.
He said it only took about 45 minutes when he first saw the flames in the hills behind his home until the fire was on top of his house. He escaped with his wife, 2 dogs, and the clothes on his back.
Up next, speculation is rising around San Francisco's Chinese consulate. That's as paper shredding trucks were spotted outside the building, prompting some to question what exactly is being destroyed. And to what extent can employees be punished for not achieving their work objectives? What you're about to see may shock you. Find out more when we return. A paper shredding truck has been spotted outside the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. Its appearance is sparking questions over just what's being destroyed and whether the consulate has something to hide. NTD's Tiffany Meyer brings us more.
Now we turn to San Francisco, where a paper document shredding truck was spotted next to the Chinese consulate there on Monday. That's after the same kind of truck appeared in front of the Chinese consulate in New York a mere 3 weeks ago. A truck with the words "shredded" on the side was seen parked at the back door of the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. 2 security vehicles were also parked nearby. 1 month ago, the U.S. government ordered the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas. That same evening, fire and smoke were seen in the consulate's backyard, indicating a final effort to destroy sensitive documents stored there. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo later called the Chinese consulate in Houston a hub of spying and intellectual property theft. Earlier this month, 2 trucks from a document destruction company were seen in front of the Chinese consulate in New York over 2 days. Over 10 trash containers visibly filled with paper were loaded onto the trucks. President Trump indicated last month that closing more Chinese consulates is possible. According to the Washington Times, the U.S. is preparing to order China to sharply reduce its number of diplomats in the U.S. The demand will reportedly even out the number of Chinese diplomats in the U.S. with the number of American diplomats stationed in China. Chinese consulates are shredding documents, though no one knows exactly what they're trying to destroy. But it's possible that some documents that Chinese citizens were forced to sign are among them. Chinese political refugee asylum holders in the U.S. will now face difficulty when applying for new passports after their old ones expire. That's because when the Chinese consulate identifies them as political asylum holders, it requires them to fill out a document of guarantee. The form asks the applicant if they've participated in activities related to their political asylum and if they're still doing so. It also questions what they think about their decision to apply for asylum. The appliers are then forced to say that their applying for political asylum was wrong and they have not suffered any persecution in China. They also have to guarantee they won't participate in activities related to political asylum. Lastly, they are made to state that they only applied for political asylum in the U.S. in order to obtain legal status. Human rights activist Yang Jianli, who now lives in the U.S., posted the forms he was made to fill out online when he applied for a passport renewal at the Chinese consulate. His documents show he was asked to admit he made a mistake when applying for political asylum, but he refused. Yang attended China's Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. Another man, Mr. Chen, told us that he and his relatives encountered similar situations. He reported being forced to sign the statement because he felt humiliated. He explained that his father was persecuted by the CCP during the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. He also described his suffering during the political upheaval. Later, his pregnant wife was even forced to get an abortion because of the country's one-child policy. He said that as a result of his experiences, he couldn't bring himself to say the persecution was fake. He called it an example of how the CCP extends its persecution of the Chinese people in the United States. One of his relatives answered the questions in alliance with the CCP in order to obtain a new passport. Now we turn to another video that's gone viral on Chinese social media. The clip shows a woman lying on the ground who appears to be unconscious. Directly above her, there's a hole through the bottom of a second-floor balcony. The injured woman was reportedly standing on the balcony before falling through the floor. What's even stranger, the building itself appears to be newly constructed. The incident took place in Pingyi County of China's eastern Shandong province.
A group of people in work uniforms were videoed crawling in front of a business building. This is a typical punishment for those who fail to achieve a satisfactory performance in their jobs.
Outside the entrance of Silverstone Plaza, a group of employees were seen crawling on the ground in a line, still wearing their work uniforms. The plaza serves as the most important business circle in Chengdu, a city home to 16 million people in southeast China. One netizen explained the odd situation, saying sarcastically that staff who didn't achieve their work goals were rewarded with a crawling course. Another netizen expressed annoyance, claiming that no job is worth trading over your dignity. Some say the people pictured are merely poor people from the lowest social classes, being bullied by the upper classes. They say the higher classes are to blame, adding that the way the lower class lives indicates the bearings and wisdom of the upper class. They concluded that the only way to put things back on track is to terminate the Chinese Communist Party. One netizen also hinted that people should learn from those in Belarus, referencing the current protests. But this shame-inducing punishment isn't an isolated phenomenon. Last month, a company from the same city punished 7 employees by forcing them to eat Reaper's hot bars, a snack considered extremely spicy that few dare to try. The staff members were made to endure the punishment after they received unsatisfactory scorecards. After eating the bars, 2 employees were hospitalized for serious stomach aches and acute gastroenteritis, but the company didn't compensate them. Instead, one was fired for what the company called behaving inconsistent with company culture.
The U.S. is sanctioning 24 Chinese companies and their executives. It's a belated response to the ongoing construction and military action in the disputed islands in the South China Sea. The move also places export restrictions on these companies. NTD's Patrick Hayden reports.
The United States has blacklisted 24 Chinese firms and executives involved in helping Beijing advance its territorial claims in the South China Sea. Daniel Wagner, CEO of Country Risk Solutions, says he's surprised it didn't happen sooner.
It really should come as no surprise to anyone that this type of action has occurred. Beijing has been illegally occupying the islands of the South China Sea for many years, and in spite of the Hague ruling in 2016, it continues to militarily occupy these islands.
Wagner says some would argue the U.S. was a little negligent in allowing China to occupy the islands in the first place, and acting now might be a little too late.
It's important for the U.S. to get involved because there is no other country that is willing to stand up to China from a military perspective. At this stage of the game, there really is no other country that would be prepared to do it, and the idea is that other allies of the United States would follow suit.
The State Department said it would impose visa restrictions on Chinese individuals responsible for or complicit in helping the Chinese military construct and militarize the islands. The sanctions restrict sales of U.S. goods to be shipped to the blacklisted companies, along with some other items made abroad with U.S. content or technology. Companies can apply for licenses to make the sales, but they must overcome a high bar for approval.
Sweden says thousands of its citizens got a false positive COVID-19 result. Their public health agency says it's because of a faulty testing kit from China.
Sweden's public health agency says about 3,700 people were told in error they had the coronavirus. They say it's due to a faulty Chinese testing kit from BGI Genomics. The agency said the kit cannot distinguish between very low levels of the virus and a negative result. 2 of the Chinese company's subsidiaries are on a U.S. economic blacklist for human rights violations. U.S. authorities gave emergency use authorization for its testing kits in March, and the test kit has been widely exported to other countries. The Swedish labs that evaluate the tests have adjusted their methodology. The agency couldn't say how many tests have been done using the kit, but only a small number of cases appear to be involved when the virus is at very low levels. Sweden said the false results only somewhat affected their statistics on infections.
Trump advisor Larry Kudlow says the administration is planning for more tax cuts and deregulation to boost investment and bring back jobs. And the U.S. announces a $1 billion plan to study AI and quantum computing. It's to keep the U.S. competitive on the global market. More on that when we return. American Airlines is looking for another government bailout. It says it'll need to cut 40,000 people without it. White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows says President Trump might take executive action to avoid the layoffs. That's if Congress fails to agree on a new stimulus package. American received $25 billion in payroll aid under the CARES Act. That allowed airlines to protect jobs through October. The industry wants another $25 billion to keep workers employed through March, when they hope travel demand will have picked up. Meadows is in contact with officials from United, American, and Delta Airlines about the matter. The flight attendants union says congressional action is ultimately needed to save jobs. And White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow says the Trump administration is looking to introduce more tax cuts to spur investment and create jobs. This as America continues its rebound from a deep recession.
Larry Kudlow spoke on the second night of the Republican National Convention. He credited President Trump's economic policies with a record economic expansion and a record low unemployment rate before the pandemic.
Blue collars, African Americans, Hispanics, women, all groups benefited enormously. Everyone was better off. A rising tide lifted all boats.
Kudlow said the CCP virus outbreak cut the prosperity short. Lockdowns and business shutdowns decimated the labor market. But he said emergency spending and tax cuts helped bring the U.S. economy back from the brink. He says the nation's economic health is coming back.
Now looking ahead, more tax cuts and regulatory rollback will be in store. Payroll tax cuts for higher wages, income tax cuts for the middle class, capital gains tax cuts for investment, productivity, and jobs.
Trump recently issued an executive order deferring payroll taxes, which he said he would seek to make permanent if re-elected. The president also said he'd like to see the capital gains tax slashed to 15%. His rival, Democrat nominee Joe Biden, has called for taxing long-term capital gains and qualified dividends at the same rate as income tax, so at 39.6% on income above $1 million. Kudlow also took a shot at Biden's plans to raise taxes on people making over $400,000 a year. According to the Tax Policy Center, it would increase tax revenue by $4 trillion over the next 10 years.
In economic terms, folks, this is no time for a $4 trillion tax hike. Coming out of the deep pandemic, who in their right mind would pick the pockets of taxpayers and drain money from their wallets and purses?
In economic terms, Kudlow framed the choice in November as being between pro-growth policies and prosperity and what he said would be a turn back to the dark days of stagnation, recession, and pessimism.
Record low mortgage rates have many people considering refinancing their homes. But those looking to refinance are likely to get hit with a new fee. Starting in December, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac will be charging an adverse market fee. It adds 0.5% of the total loan amount. According to the Mortgage Bankers Association, that ends up being roughly $1,400 on average. The fee was initially set to take effect at the beginning of September. Yesterday, regulators pushed it back to December 1st. The Federal Housing Finance Agency says the fee is related to virus-related economic uncertainty. It says it's needed to help pay for support given to homeowners through forbearance programs and foreclosure and eviction moratoriums. Loans with balances less than $125,000 will be exempt. And the U.S. government plans to invest over $1 billion in quantum computing and artificial intelligence over the next few years. It aims to keep the U.S. globally competitive in the frontier technologies.
The White House is planning to invest over $1 billion over the next 5 years into quantum computing and artificial intelligence. The effort is designed to keep ahead of competing nations like China on the emerging technology. U.S. Chief Technology Officer Michael Kratzios said it's absolutely imperative the United States continues to lead the world in AI and quantum. We know our adversaries around the world are pursuing their own advances. The Department of Energy will supervise 5 new quantum research hubs. They'll be comprised of top research universities, other national labs, and big tech companies such as IBM, Intel, Microsoft, and 2 quantum computer startups. Missing from the list are Google parent Alphabet and Honeywell International. The National Science Foundation and other agencies will invest in 7 AI institutes. They'll be hosted by universities across the country. According to the NSF director, at least 6 will be at minority-serving institutions, including historically black schools. The institutes will be a training ground for America's next generation of AI experts. A White House spokeswoman said the funding is already part of the participating agencies' budgets.
Up next, the city of Berlin is banning this weekend's demonstrations against pandemic measures. The police complained that during a similar march held earlier this month, protesters didn't wear masks or keep distanced. Top Spanish soccer team Barcelona is in turmoil. Their #1 player, Lionel Messi, wants to leave the club. Barcelona just had its first trophyless season in over a decade and suffered an 8-2 humiliating defeat. More on these after the break. Over to Europe. The Italian foreign minister urges his Chinese counterpart to respect the freedom of Hong Kong citizens. Italian lawmakers also showed their support for Hong Kong. NTD UK's Neil Woodrow will bring us news from Europe.
Thanks. Welcome to NTD UK with UK and European news. Italy's foreign minister says the rights and freedoms of Hong Kong citizens must be respected.
Luigi Di Maio raised the issue of Hong Kong when meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi.
Regarding Hong Kong, I reiterated that together with all our European partners, we have emphasized that Hong Kong's stability and prosperity based on the one country, two systems principle are essential.
The Italian government is facing domestic opposition over its close ties with the Chinese regime. 18 Italian lawmakers said in an open letter addressed to Di Maio. Both chambers of the Italian parliament have clearly and repeatedly condemned the repressive actions by Beijing and Hong Kong authorities, violating the rule of law, fundamental freedoms and international agreements governing the autonomous region. The new national security law was imposed directly by Beijing, bypassing the Hong Kong legislature. It has been heavily condemned by Western governments, rights groups and activists in the territory.
US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo criticizes British bank HSBC for its reported treatment of pro-democracy customers in Hong Kong. He says China is bullying the United Kingdom. Pompeo said he heard reports that Hong Kong-based executives at Next Media are unable to access their HSBC bank accounts. Pompeo pointed to a double standard, saying HSBC is maintaining accounts for individuals who have been sanctioned for denying freedom for Hong Kongers, while shutting accounts for those seeking freedom. Pompeo also says the US government stands ready to help the UK and its companies to resist Chinese Communist Party's bullying. HSBC is facing mounting pressure. It is attempting to balance its need to maintain access to the Chinese market and appeasing lawmakers in the US and Britain who are critical of Beijing's handling of the democracy movement in Hong Kong. And top Spanish soccer team Barcelona is in turmoil. Their #1 player, Lionel Messi, wants to leave the club.
Messi's decision comes less than 2 weeks after Barcelona's humiliating 8-2 Champions League defeat. Fans immediately gathered outside the Barcelona stadium after hearing the news.
To take the decision to leave for another club is something inexplicable. We will defend him until death, and he isn't at fault. At fault totally is the board.
As captain, Messi has criticised how the club is run after a recent drop in achievements. It's the team's first trophyless season in over a decade. The native Argentinian has been with the club since he was 13. The 6-time World's Best Player of the Year has led the team to win 10 league titles. Some fans feel betrayed.
I think it's yet another example of Messi's absolute tyranny over the past 10 years. I think Messi has been disloyal towards the club that bet on him since he was a small child and brought him into Europe and made him triumph.
The club wants captain Lionel Messi to stay, calling him the best player in history. The UK Supreme Court has unanimously dismissed appeals by China's Huawei and ZTE in patent disputes over mobile data technology with US companies Unwired Planet and Conversant Wireless. The decisions are seen as landmarks since they will force any tech company that sells devices in the UK to strike global deals with patent holders. Huawei faces paying Unwired Planet tens of millions to license their tech per year. And European Union defence ministers holding an informal meeting in Berlin. They're expected to focus on Mali, Belarus and the Eastern Mediterranean.
It is the defence ministers' first in-person meeting since the beginning of the pandemic.
We see a necessity for Europe to increase and improve its capacity to protect its own security more than it is at the moment.
The EU has been drawn into a row between Turkey and Greece over natural gas reserves off Cyprus and the extent of their continental shelves. Earlier this month, the dispute fled into a light collision between Turkish and Greek frigates.
We need to find a way to resolve the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean based on the spirit of allied solidarity and international law.
Following the talks, Berlin will hold a two-day meeting of EU foreign ministers on Thursday. The city of Berlin is banning this weekend's demonstrations against pandemic measures.
Interior Minister Andreas Geisel says the risks of several thousand people gathering are too great.
I can't take this risk, not for the police officers and not for the participants either.
Geisel said several thousand police officers will be on duty over the weekend and they will be supported by police from other German states.
But above all, I expect no violence in Berlin this weekend.
About 20,000 people took part in a march at the beginning of the month. Police filed a complaint against the organizer for failing to ensure demonstrators wore masks and kept their distance. That's all for today. Back over to New York.
Thanks, Neil. And up next, a statue has been erected in New York's Central Park in honor of some of the first women's rights activists. Today marks 100 years since women were allowed to vote nationwide. And we retrace the steps of Leonardo da Vinci's final years as we explore his castle in France. His last home is now a museum open to the public and helping his legacy live on. Women's rights activists are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. In honor of some of the first pioneers, a statue has been erected in New York's Central Park. It's worth noting here that this amendment mostly applied to white women. Most black women could only exercise that right about 5 decades later.
100 years ago, U.S. women got the right to vote. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was formally certified on August 26, 1920. It says that the right to vote shouldn't be denied because of someone's gender. But women actually started voting before 1920. States had their own regulations, so they could vote in some statewide and local elections.
So it was this gradual push to women being able to vote. So when that final ratification happened, you started to see more women exercising that vote.
The journey to the 19th Amendment can be traced back to the Seneca Falls Convention in upstate New York in 1848. The two-day summit led to an adoption of a declaration which paved the way for women's right to vote. The 72 years after that saw increased representation of women at the local level. Not all women started voting right away when the amendment was passed in 1920. Some work still had to be done.
There was that initial push to be able to help women be able to cast their ballot and know how to cast their ballot. So what you saw was this natural progression.
The first national election in which women were legally allowed to vote saw the election of Republican President Warren G. Harding.
3, 2, 1.
In honor of the 100th anniversary, a nonprofit organization unveiled the Women's Right Pioneers movement in New York's Central Park. It took the all-volunteer organization 7 years to get the 14-foot bronze statue erected. It depicts 3 women's rights activists working at a table together. A relative of one of the women displayed in the statue explained what it stands for.
And I am a relative of Susan B. Anthony. This statue represents generations of women who have fought for equal rights.
Just earlier this month, President Trump said he will pardon Susan B. Anthony posthumously. She was fined in 1872 for voting illegally.
And black women's right to vote was formally protected in 1965. And now to tennis. The U.S. Open will begin next Monday, but the atmosphere may be a little different this year. The draw will be held on Thursday in New York, with world number 1 Novak Djokovic set to lead the field.
U.S. Open organizers said they are happy with the roster of competitors for this year's tournament.
For those that have joined us, they're excited, they're happy to be here, they're happy to be back, and everyone's doing their part as a tennis community to keep everyone healthy and safe.
Several of the sport's top athletes have dropped out of the 2020 tournament. Players like defending champions Bianca Andreescu and Rafael Nadal will be absent this year. The U.S. Open usually attracts the world's greatest players to Flushing Meadows every year.
The players, I think, are incredibly happy. I think they're surprised by the experience that they have within the official hotels and the ease of everything.
The tournament is one of tennis's 4 Grand Slams, and the event is considered the crown jewel of the U.S. tennis calendar. Virus safety measures such as temperature checks and testing will be in place. The competition will also be held without fans in attendance.
Last night, a few of them were saying, gee, we like this. What's it going to be like in future years?
The hardcourt tournament begins August 31st.
Now to our series on the Renaissance. Today we go to Leonardo da Vinci's last home, a French castle where he spent the final 3 years of his life. It's now a museum dedicated to the memories of the great Italian master, as our France correspondent David Vives tells us.
A strange machine, a misty river, a painting hung up in the trees. The ambience in the French castle Clos de Lucé reflects the many mysteries surrounding the life of the Renaissance master Leonardo da Vinci. This is the castle where the painter would end his days, in Amboise, central France. The building has been owned by the St. Brie family for 7 generations. Since the 50s, it's been open to the public and was redesigned to shed a light on the Italian painter.
The mission of our family is to transmit the heritage, the memory, and the knowledge of Leonardo da Vinci.
At the request of the French king, who he became friends with, da Vinci left his homeland, Italy, to rest in the beautiful valley of Loire. But the time wasn't for retirement. At 64, the Italian master always had new ideas. A bridge for Istanbul, an irrigation system for the region where he lived, a parachute, and this war tank and cannon with multiple rifles. Some of these inventions drawn on paper could never work in reality. It seems the Renaissance master had better skills in representing divine figures rather than designing warfare machines.
Leonardo was learning everything from nature. He has a chance not to go to school, and he developed a fantastic sense of observation.
According to da Vinci, a human eye is a window for the soul. Between the contemplation of nature, prayerful reflections, and dinners cooked by his chef, he continued to work on 3 paintings he brought with him from his homeland. And St. Brie says da Vinci contributed to the emergence of Renaissance art in France.
Amboise became the cradle of the Renaissance. That's in Amboise that the Renaissance was emerging and expanding around the royal castle in the Loire Valley.
Despite the lockdown, this place draws an impressive flow of tourists from the early morning. More than 500 years after his death, the Italian master's arts still inspire, and his heritage is sure to live on. Reporting by David Vives, NTD News.
And that's all for today's news. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Stephanie Cox.